Welcome to the Mind Vine podcast, where we challenge the stigma associated with mental illness through conversations about a variety of issues impacting mental health. Here we bring you news, views, and interviews that intrigue, educate, and celebrate recovery. Leading us on this journey are the hosts of the Mind Vine podcast, Darryl Mathers and Chris Bovie.
So welcome to the Mind Vine podcast. My name is Darryl Mathers. I'm with my co-host Chris Bovie, and we have another special guest. We've had a string of really good guests lately on our podcast, so pleased to welcome André Picard. I have a few things to go through in his bio, but this is kind of like for a communications person in the healthcare field, it's a pretty big deal.
Yes.
And I remember when I first got into the field, if André Picard's writing about you, you're doing something right. It's so
or really
well.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. If you want André Picard to be writing about you, and he is,
Yes.
then you're doing something right. So thank you for being here, and we look forward to the chat we're going to have today. So for the benefit of our audience, I'm going to go through your extensive bio. You're the public health reporter at the Globe and Mail. I won't say for how long. And you're also the author of best-selling books called Critical Care, Canadian Nurses Speak for Change, and The Gift of Death, Confronting Canada's Tainted Blood Tragedy. He's won numerous awards for his writing, including the Missioner Award, Public Service Journalism, the Canadian Policy Research Award, and the Atkinson Fellowship for Public Policy Research. In 2002, he received the Centennial Prize of the Pan American Health Organization as the top public health reporter in the Americas. In 2005, he was named Canada's first public health hero by the Canadian Public Health Association. And in 2007, he was honored as a champion of mental health. So that's out of the way. So welcome again.
Thanks.
And even bringing it closer to home, honorary degree at our own University of Ontario Institute of Technology.
Yeah,
right?
really?
So that was, what was that, 2013?
Yeah, a couple of years back.
Nice. So as journalists, not in the realm of you, but I like to always find out a little bit about sort of the backstory, if we can, before we get into sort of the policy piece. But I'm interested to know, as a journalist, how did you get into the field of covering, policy, health? Was it something that you just found that opportunity, or was it a real interest for you at the time?
Yeah, so I stumbled into it, to be honest. So I started at the Globe as a summer student, we can say 30 years ago. It was a long time ago. And at the time, AIDS was just becoming a mainstream story. So AIDS had been around a few years. I had covered it. I had been involved in the student press. So I started covering AIDS. Oddly enough, because our medical reporter was not interested in covering it. And that's a funny story, because at the time, medical reporting consisted of reading medical journals, talking to expert physicians and scientists, and writing the story. And I remember her saying quite distinctly to me, because I was covering all these AIDS protests and stuff, and starting to do some more medical stories, and she'd say, "Why would you talk to patients? What do patients know? I don't know anything." And that was really the attitude at the time. And, AIDS has had a big impact as a disease worldwide, but we forget it's also changed how we do research. It's really changed how we do health journalism. It has changed how we perceive this notion of patient-centered care. So that my career is all about AIDS. I've been writing about it for almost 4 decades, believe it or not, since I wrote my first story about AIDS in 1981. Before it was called AIDS, we used to call it gay-related immune deficiency before they discovered the virus. So a long time, and it's sort of gone from there. But I think what that did was sort of shape my view that healthcare is not about medicine. It's about politics. It's about treating people like people. It's about stigma. It's about income. It's about human rights. All those things that are really important lessons that we took from AIDS. And when you start doing that, it naturally leads you into other areas. And one of them is mental health, which is very there were actually with AIDS were a lot of mental health issues early on when there was no treatments. AIDS would go into the brain, and there were a lot of dementia, really young men and stuff, and then psychosis and all kinds. So I kind of got interested in mental health because of AIDS once again, and again has been writing about it for a long time.
Now, obviously, as the premier voice when it comes to health and policy, you must get inundated with people like, this issue, cover this story, my story. As a journalist, how do you kind of filter through that, and how do you decide where your focus is going to be?
Yeah, so I guess I start from the starting point for me is I do cover policy, so I kind of leave the medical stuff aside. I have to know a little bit about it peripherally, but I say, there's 1,000 journalists who write about medicine, and I write about policy, and that weeds it out quite a bit because not enough people research policy. A lot of them research medicine and don't talk about the practical of implementing it, paying for it, the human rights implications, etc. So that narrows it down to start off with. So I can eliminate a lot of those pitches from the get-go. And then it becomes an issue of, what's important, what's hot. A lot of stuff we do is we call it off the news, so something else is going on. So a common example I've used over the years is when Stephen Harper was Prime Minister. Stephen Harper had asthma. He didn't talk about it publicly, but he would often end up at the emergency room. So, we should write about asthma. And not because Stephen Harper has it, but because it's sort of put it out there. Mm-hmm. Wow, even someone that powerful and rich can have this disease, and imagine you need to be hospitalized for it. So things like that pop up in the news, and I try and think, what's the policy aspect of this and what could be different? A lot of it is about variety. I could write a breast cancer story every day for the rest of my life. There's enough research, but that wouldn't be interesting to me or to the readers. And then, I'm always interested in sort of the human rights aspect of illness, who's being wronged, who could be treated better. And again, that's something that leads you quite quickly to mental health, which are the most mistreated and undertreated population.
Right. Throughout your career, you've probably seen waves of issues and illnesses being treated or receiving different levels of public profiling. The kind of the journey of cancer research, for example, is well documented. You didn't talk about it 50, 60 years ago and look at it, what it is today and how far that cause has come. When did you kind of first dip your toe into the waters of mental health as a journalist, and what was it like then compared to what it's like now?
Well, I remember quite distinctly, and I was brand new at the Globe. And again, it was one of these, when you're new, you kind of do everything. They just sort of throw you out there to the kind of marginal stories. And I remember there was a protest at the time I was in Toronto at Queen's Park, and it was a bunch of mothers who had just created this group called Friends of Schizophrenia. So mums whose children, almost all sons, had schizophrenia, and they were complaining about the lack of treatment. And it was a really touching, emotional press conference. They told their stories. I really remember to this day the story of one of the mums telling of her son dying by suicide in her kitchen, killing himself in front of her in full psychosis, and how she had been turned away from emergency rooms time and time again. We can't do anything for him, he's fine, he'll be okay. And then telling the outcome of this was so tragic. So I guess that's 30 years ago, and those kind of stories touch you, and they're all about, why do we treat these people differently? As she said, if he had had a heart attack, they wouldn't have sent him home, right? He'd been treated pronto. Mm-hmm. But if it's above the neck, we kind of go, not our problem. There's just kind of a lot of blame that goes with mental illness. It's invisible, so it's like, they're just acting up. Especially with schizophrenia, it tends to be young men. Well, he's just being a jerk. Oh, he's been drinking. Yeah, he's been drinking. He's self-medicating. You have to distinguish that. So all these, the complexity of those stories, I think, was attractive to me as a writer. There's a lot to sink your teeth into. But the flip side of it is there's a lot of frustration because so little gets done.
And I would think, working in the field, like for the longest time, it felt like you were the only one that was listening to us. We were constantly emailing you and reaching out to you because there wasn't a big appetite for those stories from the media and the public. The media is a representation of the public, but that has changed dramatically. To our benefit, you're not the only one that cares about this issue anymore. So there's been a real evolution just in the time that you've been working in this sector.
Yeah, and I think it's not that I'm the only one who cared. I think there are all kinds of societal taboos and stigmas and et cetera. So I really, I have to give a lot of credit to my paper that they went out on a limb on a lot of these things, or one of the real benefits of working for the Globe as a writer is they do give us a lot of leeway. It's a lot of media are really centrally controlled, and we're going to tell you what to do today, and that's that. At the Globe, there's much more, give us a new idea. And, that's interesting. Like the schizophrenia story as an example is just a routine assignment. Would probably be a few lines, but then I'd say, I want to do a little bit more on that. And say, okay, well, when you have some free time, sure. and we'll look at it. So they allow you to explore that, and I think it makes for a richer paper. And the other thing the paper does is, they essentially take on a cause. We do a couple a year, and we have these meetings. What's going to be our issue this year? And pretty early on, the mental health issue kept coming up again and again. And I think it took some brave editors and even some brave ownership to say, yeah, we're going to do this. When we do these big projects, they're often, 10, 20 pages of newsprint, which is literally hundreds of thousands of dollars of investment, right? Mm-hmm. So it has to be a corporate decision that this is important. And it's, people say, you just want to sell papers. There's a little bit of that, but there's also we want to have an influence. We want to change policy, and we want to find an area where there's a real lack. And I think between editors and reporters and other people, we're real people too, believe it or not, and everybody has mental health issues in their families, right? And I think journalists maybe were a little bit more open. We talk about stuff, so maybe those discussions happened in our workplace a little earlier than elsewhere, and that kind of helped us push that public conversation.
Do you think that's going to get harder actually with the way we deal with information now? Everything's quick information at surface, where what you do is you actually dig behind and find the reasons, the policy, the human story, and that's missing a lot. And I guess my worry, and hopefully we don't get there, is with the way young people consume information now. It's very quick, very short. It's very headline focused. And do you think there'll be less and less media that will have the opportunity to tell those in-depth stories?
Well, it's interesting. At our paper, we're actually doing more of those in-depth stories now, because the attitude is you can get the every daily news thing free online. Mm-hmm. So how do we distinguish ourselves? And how we distinguish ourselves is doing these bigger projects and exposés. Now the question is, will the public pay for that? Are they going to buy it? So far, so good. Yeah. I think it's been the bigger projects in the last couple of years. This is a newish trend. They've worked out, I think, financially, and that's important for the media as well. Right. And we haven't had to, we don't do features on the Kardashians because that's going to sell papers, because other people can do that. That's what TMZ is for, right? So we do take issues that others are not covering and try and make those our own. And I hope that continues. So to me, in the media, there's a lot of bad things going on in the media. The bad journalism is getting much worse, but we forget that the good journalism is getting much better. Right. So there is some hope there if it can be monetized.
And I guess one of the greatest, aspects of journalism is, especially for someone that covers issues like that, is when you see what you do change thinking or change policy. What would you say in your career to date has been your greatest achievement or cause that you saw sort of change enacted because of the attention that you brought to it?
I think a couple of things. One, of course, is the mental health stuff, and this is not, again, it's not me. Journalism is teamwork, but I think the Globe really, even I'd say the 2000 or so, we started doing this stuff, and then did bigger and bigger projects, and I think it's really changed the public conversation. To me, one of the watershed moments was I remember doing an interview with Michael Wilson, the finance minister. This guy, very dour, man of steel, tough guy, conservative, Bay Street. And I had heard, I knew his son had died by suicide. Canada's a small community when you get right down to it. So it was kind of known, but not talked about, as suicide never was. And I had tried for a while, sort of through different channels to say, I wonder if he would talk about this. And people would go, oh my God, Michael Wilson, he's like a stone. Of course not. And then at a certain point, he did. And to me, that was one of the most important stories, because it just said to people, wow, if this can hit his family, and if he can talk about it, well, who can't, right? And he's gone on to become this real champion of mental illness that people had never dreamed of. He would take on that role. So that, to me, was a big one. If you want to talk about impact, I spent many years covering the tainted blood tragedy. It was not a mental health issue, but a different kind of policy issue. And that's one where, again, we invested a lot of resources in it, hammered away at the story literally for years until the government called a public inquiry. That inquiry led to more than $5 billion in compensations. So that's a phenomenal outcome. Again, it's not me alone, but you sort of take some pride in, I kind of got the ball rolling on that one, and I wrote a book on that topic, and it again had real broad repercussions in the voice of patients being heard, how we regulate drugs, all kinds of things, how we look at public institutions, because we had the Red Cross at the time, a really respected institution, which, openly lied for many years, and it cost people their lives. So I think it changed the way we look at groups like that. So it had really far-reaching impacts. So I said those are the two biggies for me.
So I wanted to, and I know Darryl wants to talk a little bit about why you were here today and the great things that are going on, but I wanted to ask you, and this is a loaded one, so everyone get comfortable. I don't know how hard this will be, but you hear in the mental health addiction system, we know it's fragmented. We know there's issues. You hear different interest groups saying just pour more money. And as someone that covers policy but also understands the fiscal reality, if the federal government or the provinces came to André Picard and said, fix our mental health and addiction system, what would you do to change to make it more impactful or effective for Canadians or Ontarians? Or
Yeah, so I'd start with addressing the first part of your question, was the money one. So I do all kinds of talks, and people always ask me that because I write about policy. Well, do we spend enough on healthcare? And my answer, or do we spend enough on mental health? My answer is always the same, and it sounds flippant, but it's not. I say, I don't have the slightest idea whether we spend enough, because I don't know what we're trying to do. And that's a really fundamental thing. What is the goal of our health system? It's a $228 billion a year corporation with no goals. There's no written goals. Our only goal seems to be spend more money than last year. So I think that's where I'd start. I'd be really more business-like about it. That's a dirty word in healthcare, but here's my 5 goals that I want to achieve. And the countries who have the best healthcare systems do that. If you go to Sweden, there's a 10-point plan every year. These are the 10 priorities, and we're going to do them. And if we don't, there's going to be a report card at the end of the year. And if we don't, it's probably heads will roll. And the system runs well like that. So I think we need more of that focus.
Is that a single source accountability too? Or?
Well, no, it's a huge sprawling system, so there has to be different levels of accountability. But ultimately, it comes down to the person in power. They're accountable for doing that. What we have in Canada is we have our political leaders who micromanage things. So something appears on the front page of the newspaper, and they call up and say, "Oh, give that lady her drugs or her treatment. We don't want that on the front page of the Toronto Star." And that's not how they should be running the system. They should be saying, here are the public health priorities, and I'm going to hire good people to implement them. And if they don't do it, I'm going to demand to know why. So I think we should have a different style of leadership. Right. On the mental health file specifically, I would do something similar. I would say, listen, what are the goals? What's the purpose? And then more broadly, I think the most important thing for me is I would remove this artificial distinction between mental and physical health. I think that's been one of the biggest barriers to getting people fair access and fair treatment. Nobody just has one thing at a time. If you're depressed, you have physical illness. If you have heart disease, you almost invariably have depression. It's an artificial distinction. And when we do talk about mental health issues specifically, I like to use the term now brain disease. So we have brain diseases, we have heart diseases, we have liver diseases. If you treat them more like that, I think there's more equity as well. But I think, you have to understand, I'm a big fan of the history of Medicare. I really like reading about the history, and I wrote a book about the history of Medicare. And I think it really it helps us understand some of the flaws in our system if we know the history. And in mental health, there's really a lot of cultural baggage. So when we brought about Medicare, and we're just about to have the 60th anniversary of Medicare, and that Medicare was born when the federal government decided to fund half of health expenses. So in 1957, they decided to pay for half of hospital expenses in provinces on the condition that it be universal and on the condition there be no user fees. So that's the beginning of Medicare. But there's a little asterisk there, a little clause in that agreement that said, oh, by the way, we're not going to pay for psychiatric hospitals. Why? Well, those are part of the correction system. They're not part of the health system. And we are paying the price for that decision to this day, right? psychiatric institutions degraded terribly because suddenly hospitals had 50% more funding that they didn't get. They wasted away. We brought in a policy of deinstitutionalization, which was partially a civil rights issue. Some of it was good, but a large part of it was just hidden cost cutting. We don't want to pay for these institutions because we're not getting any federal money. So it's 100% provincial baggage. We don't want this. So we let people out. In 1960, right after Medicare was introduced, there were 60,000 psychiatric beds in Canada. Today there are 6,000. There's a tenth of the number, 3 times the population. Now, there were too many people in hospital then, right, but there are too few now. So we have to get those balances right. And I think if you know the history, I think it helps you understand how we have this problem, and hopefully it helps you understand why it has to be corrected. Right. So a long rambling answer.
That's okay.
There you go.
That's great.
Just speaking of our current system, I know just given the nature of the way healthcare works in Canada and mental health care works in Ontario, you have people like us contacting you with story ideas, trying to get you to pay attention to certain issues and policy changes, trying to shift the way mental health care is moving in the province. I'm wondering, when you're in your day-to-day interactions with these people, can you describe like how passionate this group is, like for change, or how passionate they are for attention? Like, what is it like dealing with that group of people like you do across the country every day?
Well, I think people are generally, one of the single most important things in our lives is our health. So every patient group, every institution is passionate about what they do. It's one of the great things about our health system is the healthcare workers are totally invested in it, right? It's not about money, it's not about power, it's about, we're going to make people better. And so it's really great to see that. Of course I get bombarded, but I don't think one group is more passionate than another. Some have the advantage of knowing the system better, having more education, having more money. But ultimately, I always tell people, I get invited to advocacy groups. How can we get the government's ear? What do we have to do? And I always tell them, you don't have to do these $1 million campaigns, and you don't have to have these public speaking experts tell you how to spin stuff. You just have to be real, be invested in your story, tell your story. Now, there's not always the outlet to do that or the opportunity, but it doesn't always have to be the Globe and Mail. It can be your local paper, it can be your blog online. The good thing about the way the media has changed is there's many, many outlets for your passion. So I guess for me, it comes back to what I said earlier. It's sort of whimsy, if I could put it that way. I sort of pick and choose stuff that I can do. I can only do so much. But I always encourage people, I'm not the only one out there. There's a lot of stuff that can be done in different ways.
Speaking of passion and passionate patients and staff, I think you saw some of that today at the Grand Rounds presentation, which was hosted by our eating disorders unit. And you spent some time with them today. So I was wondering if you could tell us about kind of what your experience has been like today in working with that group.
Yeah, so that's an example of, why do I want to write about eating disorders? Because it's sort of the we always often say mental health is the orphan of Medicare, and eating disorders is probably the orphan of mental health, right? So if it's really the forgotten of the forgotten parts. So that intrigues me. Why is this group cast aside? How can we change that? And I think the simple answer to me is, well, this is a disease that strikes young women. So voiceless people in our society, young women are sort of dismissed as they're just young kids and they're just girls. All they care about is their looks. But, this is a real serious illness. And so if you can take that story, that stigma, and then put some policy solutions to it, to me it makes for a really good story. And the opportunity here today was one that, when I heard about it, I said, I'll be there. And, no matter what, this is really unique. A bunch of young patients doing grand rounds, which is, traditionally this medical guy gets up there in the white coat and pontificates. And the girls sort of taking charge. And, I love the part where they told the doctor, hey, you've gone over your time. Sit down. You're eating into our time. Yeah. That's how healthcare should be. It should be a conversation between patients and providers. It shouldn't be this paternalistic thing. So to me, it was really refreshing and insightful to see them in action.
Great. Well, it's been great and insightful to have you here. We appreciate you taking the time and visiting Ontario Shores and joining us on the podcast. And we hope to see you again for a future project. Maybe we'll just because we had you on doesn't mean we're not going to stop bugging you. So
Exactly.
but we do appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
We know the path we walk together begins